Hi, this is Chapter 3 of The Picture of Dorian Gray, selected highlights from Chapter 3. And in short, we're going to get the backstory of Dorian Gray, which is a rather grim story. His mother, who was really good looking, married or found this guy beneath her social station, this lower than her in social class man. And her father, Dorian's grandfather, didn't approve and had this man murdered. And then brought the daughter and the baby back to him. And then the mother died, and Dorian was left being looked after by this grim old man. Also in this chapter, Lord Henry is going to bump into Dorian again and continue his manipulation. So it's the next day, Lord Henry Wotton strolled from Curzon Street over to the Albany, a club, I guess, to call on his uncle Lord Fermor. And a whole lot of details about Lord Fermor that I've skipped, and finally goes inside and meets him. And what's he there for? He wants information. Not useful information, of course, useless information. And of course the information is about Mr. Dorian Gray, and he already knows some things. He says, "This is what I've come to learn, Uncle George, or rather I know who he is. He is the last Lord Kelso's grandson. His mother was a Devereux, Lady Margaret Devereux. I want you to tell me about his mother. What was she like? Whom did she marry? You have known nearly everybody in your time, so you might have known her. I'm very much interested in Mr. Gray at present. I've only just met him." "Kelso's grandson," echoed the old gentleman. "Kelso's grandson, of course. I knew his mother intimately. I believe I was at her christening. She was an extraordinarily beautiful girl, Margaret Devereux, and made all the men frantic by running away with a penniless young fellow, a mere nobody, sir, a subaltern in a foot regiment or something of that kind. Certainly I remember the whole thing as if it happened yesterday. The poor chap was killed in a duel at Spa a few months after the marriage. There was an ugly story about it. They said Kelso got some rascally adventurer, some Belgian brute, to insult his son-in-law in public, paid him so to do it, paid him, and that the fellow spitted his man as if he'd been a pigeon. The thing was hushed up, but egad, Kelso ate his chop alone at the club for some time afterward. He brought his daughter back with him, I was told, and she never spoke to him again. Oh yes, it was a bad business. The girl died too, died within a year. So she left a son, did she? I'd forgotten that. What sort of boy is he? If he's like his mother, he must be a good-looking chap. We know that he is. He is good-looking, assented or agreed Lord Henry. I hope he'll fall into proper hands. He should have a pot of money waiting for him if Kelso did the right thing by him. His mother had money too. All the Selby property came to her through her grandfather, and later in the novel we'll see Dorian's home, country house at Selby. And the Lord Fermor says, "What on earth induced her to behave as she did, I never could understand. She could have married anybody she chose. She was romantic, though. All the women of that family were." And long chitter-chatter now between Lord Henry and Lord Fermor, which I'm skipping. So there was the story of Dorian Gray's parentage. Crudely as it had been told to him, it had yet stirred him by its suggestion of a strange, almost modern romance. A beautiful woman risking everything for a mad passion. A few wild weeks of happiness cut short by a hideous, treacherous crime. Months of voiceless agony, and then a child born in pain. The mother snatched away by death, the boy left to solitude and the tyranny of an old and loveless man. Yes, it was an interesting background. It posed the lad, made him more perfect, as it were. Behind every exquisite thing that existed, there was something tragic. And how charming he had been at dinner the night before, as with startled eyes and lips parted in frightened pleasure, he had sat opposite to him at the club, the red candle shade staining to a richer rose the wakening wonder of his face. Talking to him was like playing upon an exquisite violin. He answered to every touch and thrill of the bow. There was something terribly enthralling in the exercise of influence. Lord Henry's enjoying this manipulation. No other activity was like it. To project one's soul into some gracious form and let it tarry there for a moment. To hear one's own intellectual views echoed back to one with all the added music of passion and youth. To convey one's temperament into another as though it were a subtle fluid or a strange perfume. There was a real joy in that. He was a marvellous type too, this lad, whom by so curious a chance he'd met in Basil's studio, or could be fashioned into a marvellous type at any rate. Grace was his, and the white purity of boyhood, and beauty such as old Greek marbles kept for us. There was nothing that one could not do with him. He has so much potential. Of course, Lord Henry's going to bring out the worst. So he's gone to his aunt for lunch. I'm not sure what this facile excuse is about. Oh, because he's arrived late. So he made a stupid excuse. He invented a facile excuse, and having taken the vacant seat next to her, looked round to see who was there. Dorian bowed to him shyly from the end of the table, a flush of pleasure stealing into his cheek. So Lord Henry is at his best now with his wit and his philosophies, because Dorian is at lunch. We're talking here about Americans, and there's a joke from Lord Henry about novels. Lady Agatha says of Lord Henry, he never means anything that he says. And a joke here, they say that when good Americans die, they go to Paris, someone says, and the Duchess says, really? And where do bad Americans go to when they die? And Lord Henry says, they go to America. In other words, America's like hell. The subject of Dorian Gray comes up, and Lord Henry says, I want him to play piano to me. Lord Henry also shows he really doesn't care about anyone else's suffering. He says, I sympathize with everything except suffering. I cannot sympathize with that. It is too ugly, too horrible, too distressing. There's something terribly morbid in the modern sympathy with pain. One should sympathize with the color, the beauty, the joy of life. The less said about life's sores, the better. This Duchess blushes, and she says, when an old woman like myself blushes, it's a very bad sign. Ah, Henry, I wish you would tell me how to become young again. He says, can you remember any great error that you committed in your early days, Duchess? A great many, I fear. He says, then commit them over again. To get back one's youth, one has merely to repeat one's follies or one's foolish behavior. A delightful theory, she exclaimed. I must put it into practice. Someone else says it's a dangerous theory, but Harry goes on and says, yes, that's one of the great secrets of life. Nowadays, most people die of a sort of creeping common sense and discover when it is too late that the only thing one never regrets are one's mistakes. He's being witty. There's a laugh around the table. He played with the idea and grew willful, tossed it into the air and transformed it, let it escape and recaptured it, made it iridescent with fancy and winged it with paradox. It was an extraordinary improvisation. He felt that the eyes of Dorian Gray were fixed on him, and the consciousness that amongst his audience there was one whose temperament he wished to fascinate seemed to give his wit keenness and to lend colour to his imagination. He was brilliant, fantastic, irresponsible. He charmed the listeners out of themselves, and they followed his pipe, laughing. Dorian Gray never took his gaze off him, but sat like one under a spell, smiles chasing each other over his lips, and wonder growing grave in his darkening eyes. Lord Henry says the English, the British, have the least sense of the beauty of literature. He's going to the park, Lord Henry, but right at the end of the chapter, as he leaves, Dorian Gray touches him on the arm and says, let me come with you. Henry says, but I thought you'd promised Basil Hallward to go and see him. I would sooner come with you. Yes, I feel I must come with you. Do let me. And you will promise to talk to me all the time. No one talks so wonderfully as you do. Ah, I've talked quite enough for today, said Lord Henry, smiling. All I want now is to look at life. You may come and look at it with me, if you care to. We assume that from there, his influence over Dorian continues. So that's the brief chapter 3, our backstory of Dorian and Lord Henry's continued influence over poor old Dorian Gray. Hope to see you again for chapter 4 next time.